Hey guys, Miss Carlson here. Couldn't figure out how to make the program that I'm using record myself and my screen, so we're just going to go with the screen. So we are talking about the rock cycle. The rock cycle is kind of like the water cycle in that it's how rocks travel. They can change into different rocks, just like our water droplets can change into different forms of water. So the first thing that you need to know what a rock cycle picture looks like. So when we are looking at the rock cycle, I've already started it here, but you're going to need 5 things in every rock cycle. You're going to need your metamorphic rock, your sedimentary rock, and your igneous rock. You're also going to need the thing that makes igneous rock, which is magma. Also, I know lava, but lava comes from magma. And you're going to need sediment because that's how sedimentary rocks are made. So here I've started it. You're going to notice that all of my arrows are color coordinated. So each movement in the rock cycle is going to be color coordinated. So we start with magma. Magma has to cool and solidify to form an igneous rock. Okay, we've already learned that. This is all things that we've already learned. We're just kind of putting it together. Next, to get from an igneous rock to sediment, you have to have weathering and erosion. So essentially, next unit, if we get there, we talk about how rocks can be weathered and eroded. Basically, wind, water, ice, gravity is going to break down this rock and change it into sediment. Now, unlike the water cycle where a water molecule had to go through certain stages, it had to evaporate and then condense and then in order to precipitate, that's not necessarily the case here. Here, you're going to see that different rocks can turn into different things and it's not going to necessarily follow a particular order, okay? So, sedimentary rocks can turn back into sediment, and metamorphic rocks can also turn into sediment. So you have each type of rock turning into sediment. So you can see on the screen that you have igneous going to sediment, metamorphic going to sediment, and sedimentary going to sediment. And every time you have an arrow pointing at sediment, it's weathering and erosion because those rocks are being broken down in those tiny little particles. Now, sediment to sedimentary, we've talked about. This is how sedimentary rocks are made. It's through cementation and compaction. So anytime you see an arrow pointing from sediment and going to sedimentary, so it starts at sediment and it goes to sedimentary, that's why we have our arrow pointing to sedimentary, you're always going to write cementation and compaction. Sedimentary to metamorphic, any type of rock can turn into a metamorphic rock and it's going to go through heat and pressure. Remember, that's how metamorphic rock is formed. It has other rocks turn into metamorphic rocks when it undergoes lots of heat and pressure. So just like you can have multiple ways to get to sediment, we have multiple ways to get to metamorphic. So sedimentary rocks can turn into metamorphic rocks, igneous rocks can turn into metamorphic rocks, and actually, if you want to get technical, metamorphic rocks can turn into metamorphic rocks, but I don't have that arrow here because I don't. Now, metamorphic rocks can turn into magma by melting. They're deep into earth, right? They melt and they turn back into magma. Just like with sediment and metamorphic, you can get to magma multiple different ways. Sedimentary can turn into magma, igneous can turn into magma, and metamorphic can turn into magma. They're all going to do it the same way, by melting. So, at the end, you have something that looks like this, which is very confusing. Now notice, I'm going to go back a slide. This layout, how we have our rock cycle, and this layout look different. But you can see some things are still the same. Magma is always going to be next to igneous in the rock cycle. Sediment is always going to be next to sedimentary in the rock cycle because that's how each one forms. So this is what it looks like blank, okay? This is what it looks like filled in. Now you notice Mrs. Carlson got a little lazy and she didn't write weathering and erosion for all of our arrows pointed to sediment. I put W and E. That just means weathering and erosion. But you can see just like as we were going through it, that we have 3 arrows pointing at sediment, from igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary, and they're all labeled with the same thing. So here you can see that an igneous rock can turn into magma, and then that magma can turn back into an igneous rock, which is fine. Sediment can turn into a sedimentary rock, and then that sedimentary rock can turn right back into sediment. So as you can see, it can kind of go all over the place, but really all you have to think about when you're looking at the rock cycle is using those key terms that we've already talked about: cooling and solidification, cementation and compaction, heat and pressure. When you looked at the sediment notes that you had to take before we talked about sedimentary rocks, we talked about how sediment was made. It was made from weathering. So the only thing that is new-ish here is magma, and that is just from our rock smelting. So this is the final product. This is what a rock cycle looks like when it's completed. You will see in the videos that we watched this week, some people use different terminology, but this is the stuff that I want you to use. So if I give you a forms to do or some different activity to use, these are the words that I'm looking for, because if we were in school or when you go back to school and you have to talk about this again, because that's what all science is, you always talk about it again. Kind of like math, it builds on each other. You might not talk about the rock cycle for a minute, but at some point in time, you come back to it. So this is the information that I want you to remember. Heat and pressure is always going to be metamorphic. Melting is always going to be magma. Cooling and solidification always makes an igneous rock. Sediment, always made by weathering and erosion, and a sedimentary rock, always by cementation and compaction. So if you can remember those 5 different terms, you'll be able to figure out the rock cycle pretty easily. This week, you will be watching 2 videos over the rock cycle. Like I said, they might not use the same kind of terminology we use, but that's fine. You'll be able to understand it. And then we'll be working on IXL like we did last week, and it's going to be over the rock cycle. Last week, I noticed some of us, so I didn't know this, but if you get a SMART score of a 100 and you haven't answered 20 questions, that's fine. That shows me that you can comprehend it enough to get a SMART score of 100. So this week, you are going to be required to answer 15 questions correctly instead of 20. Or if you get a SMART score of 100, you can stop. So that means if you answer 5 questions correctly and you get a SMART score of 100, you're fine. Moving on, you're done. Also, to that point, some of you last week decided that you were going to answer 83 questions in 7 minutes. So you're not necessarily learning anything from that. It probably would be a lot easier to just go through and answer the questions accurately. So then that way you're actually learning information. But if that's not what you want to do and you want to answer 43 questions in 6 minutes and hopefully you get some right, then I guess that's on you. But at the end of the week on Friday, I go through and I see how many questions you answered, how many questions you answered correctly, and that's how I get your score. Last week, you had 2 assignments, so like 2 graded assignments, so I took the higher of them. This week, you don't have that. Your assignments this week are this video, and then the 2 videos that I've assigned you, and then the IXL. So the only grade you'll get this week is from IXL. Next week, you'll have 2 assignments that are graded. And unlike last week where I took the best one, I'll be taking both of them, just so you know you're doing everything you can to learn the rock cycle. We will be doing a Zoom on Wednesday, just like we did last week. If you have any questions, you can come. If you don't have any questions, you don't have to show up unless you want me to see your beautiful face, which I'm okay with. But it is mainly for if you have any questions. So I hope you have a great week. I miss and love every single one of you, and I hope that you are doing well.